Hello, and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week and Agreement Express. I'm Tvitalina Gabin, Assistant Director of Events and Programs at Compliance Week, and I will be your host. Today's webcast will discuss upcoming Labor Department Fiduciary Rule. Before we hear from our presenters, let me quickly go over the agenda. We're scheduled to go for 1 hour. After this brief introduction, we'll jump right into presentation, which will be followed by a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen. I'll pose them to our guests at the end of the presentation. After the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CP credit for all attendees. Please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. To obtain your CP credit, wait until the webcast is completely over and I sign off. At that point, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. Should you have any trouble receiving the certificate or obtaining a copy of the slides, please email us at info@complianceweek.com. A few other administrative details: at any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of the screen. You can also hit the View Slide Full Screen button at the bottom of your screen if you wish to increase the slide size. And lastly, a Help button is located at the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Please visit complianceweek.com and click on the webcast tab in the blue horizontal navigation bar for our upcoming webcast schedule or to register for another webcast. And at this point, I would like to welcome our presenters. Today with us, we have Mike Gardner, CEO of Agreement Express. With over 20 years of experience in the software industry, he has involved Agreement Express to be trusted platform by top financial institutions. With him, we also welcome Scott Moss, Co-Chair of Regulatory and Compliance at Lowenstein Sandler. In his role, he counsels hundreds of investment management clients in the implementation of compliance programs. Scott is also a prominent author and adjunct professor at Rutgers School of Law. Welcome to you both, and now I'd like to virtually pass the microphone to you, Scott.
Thank you very much. So, hello out there in cyber world. It's a little bit easier when I present live because I get to see people's faces and encourage questions. For this, I know there's questions at the end, so what I'm aiming to do is give some background on the DOL Fiduciary Rule, the basics, what it covers, what it prohibits, what the exceptions are, and then kind of tee it up with what it means for the industry, advisors, brokers, and hedge fund managers or private equity managers. So to start at the basics, the fiduciary rule, if anybody didn't get it from the title, is focused on fiduciary duty and acting in the best interest of the client. For ERISA, that's really nothing new because ERISA long had a fiduciary standards and there were fiduciaries under ERISA, but it happened with a 5-part test. So what this rule really does is broaden up who is a fiduciary and who has to act in the best interest of the client. For investment advisors, they've always been fiduciaries. They've always had to act in the best interest of the client when providing advice. I try and warn clients it's a little bit of a misnomer to say we're fiduciary under like SEC or securities laws, so it's no big deal to be a securities or a fiduciary under ERISA. I kind of call ERISA fiduciary like fiduciary on steroids when compared even with the SEC standards or Advisors Act. There's really a heightened kind of sensitivity to conflicts of interest when you're dealing with retirement plans and retirement savings. But IAs can take a little bit of comfort that they've always been a fiduciary and a lot of their policies will be dealing with acting in the best interest of the client. For brokers, it's a newer world because this is the kind of the first foray into a fiduciary rule or fiduciary standard. It's been talked about for a lot of years, but up until this rule, and this rule only applies to ERISA and IRA money, and I'll get to that in a minute, it's a bigger change for them because brokers just dealt with a suitability standard. So they didn't have to be a fiduciary. They could just show not that they were acting in the best interest of clients, but their actions were suitable for the clients. So, what does the rule do? It treats recommendations to plan assets as a fiduciary. So when you're recommending investments or providing certain investment advice for a fee, and the fee could be direct or indirect, it doesn't have to specifically be a check that's written on the indirect context, and it applies to plans, plan fiduciaries, participants in the plans, beneficiaries, or also individual retirement accounts and IRA owners. And I get asked sometimes how it picks up IRAs, because IRAs are technically different than like Title I ERISA assets, but the Internal Revenue Code has similar prohibited transaction language to ERISA, so it kind of gets to the IRAs by extension, even though you might not think of Department of Labor as necessarily governing IRAs. So it really ties into a recommendation, and the fiduciary rule defines that recommendation specifically. So a communication that, based on its content, context, and presentation, would reasonably be viewed as a suggestion that the advice recipient engaged in or refrained from taking a particular course of action. And that's the second bullet right on the slides that should be in front of everybody. So let's drill down on that. So a recommendation is essentially something that's individually tailored, and we're looking for specific advice to a specific recipient, and it's supposed to be an objective standard, not a subjective standard. But sometimes people have questions on the recommendation, so I like to frame it in what's not a recommendation. So if you provide a platform to a plan fiduciary for making and monitoring plan investments, that's not a recommendation. If you provide objective financial data, so research or benchmark comparisons, not a recommendation. If you generally communicate, so you go on TV, you honk horns, you say, I like Tesla, I don't like Tesla, it's not geared to a specific person or their goals. It's really general newsletters, commentary, speeches, research reports, not a recommendation. And also kind of investment education. So if you talk about general planning, general financial investments, general retirement information, general asset allocation models, once again, not geared towards a specific person, not a recommendation. Otherwise, think investment advice. If you advise somebody on acquiring, holding, disposing, especially a security, it doesn't have to be security, it could be other investment property, that's a recommendation. If you give a specific person specific advice about how they should invest securities, and that includes rollovers, so if you're rolling over an IRA and you suggest how that rollover should occur or what the money should go to, that's a recommendation. If you're talking about strategies, portfolio composition, selection of persons that should advise, so even the selection of an investment advisor, that's all a recommendation. So we're looking kind of objective standard, specifically tailored to the individual. So now, what does it mean if you give a recommendation? So it means if you are subject to this rule, you are subject to the prohibited transaction standards in the Internal Revenue Code and Title I of ERISA. And that fiduciary duty kind of on steroids, as I put it before, that says we're trying to prohibit conflicts of interest. And the biggest conflict of interest is when you receive compensation that varies based upon the investment advice you give. So that includes compensation you get directly from a plan. It also includes compensation from third parties. So to put kind of a finer point on it, we're talking about commissions, we're talking about sales loads, we're talking about 12B1 fees, fees that vary, or in the broker world, you may hear the phrase transaction-based compensation, otherwise kind of colloquially known as commissions. That's prohibited under the ERISA standards. And receipt of these kinds of payments would generally violate those prohibited transactions unless you have an exemption. And the DOL Fiduciary Rule gives us two new exemptions. And the first one becomes, I think, really important to this rule. The second one is also important, but I think most people will rely on that first one. And that first one is the best interest contract exemption. So the best interest contract exemption, first question that people ask me is, how do I pronounce the acronym? And I've heard it pronounced BIC, I've heard it pronounced BICE, I've heard it in one of the prep calls to this session of BIC-E. If you're French, maybe BIC-A. I don't think one's right, I don't think one's wrong. I've heard a lot of people say different things, so I like to say best interest contract exemption and avoid it. Otherwise, I call it BIC. But all those kind of things are getting at the same exemption. So, this basically is an exemption to the prohibited transaction rules. So it's important to note it's not an exemption from being a fiduciary. If you're relying on the BIC exemption, you're still a fiduciary. You still have to act in the best interest in the best interest of the client, but you don't have to be subject to the prohibited transaction rules. And this allows you to provide investment advice or recommendations to retail retirement investors and not have to abide by the prohibited transaction rules. So first, a retail retirement investor, that includes participants, it includes IRA owners that can self-direct, it includes plans and IRAs that are not managed by banks or insurance companies or registered investment advisors or brokers, or plans that have less than $50 million in AUM. So it's a really nice way that you can still get commission type of payments, even though there might be a push to level fees, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it's a nice exemption. But not all BIC exemptions are created equal. There's what I call a full BIC exemption, and then there's what I'll call a streamlined BIC exemption. So first, to get that full BIC exemption, you have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. The first thing you have to do, and this goes to the heart of the rule, is you have to acknowledge the fiduciary status with respect to the investment advice you give. And if you give an investment advice to a portion of a plan or to a plan participant that self-directs, you're not a fiduciary to the entire plan, but you are a fiduciary to the portion that you advise, and you must acknowledge it to the retirement investor. You also have to adhere to the impartial conduct standards, and this requires you to essentially do three things. One, you have to provide advice that's in the retirement investor's best interest. So that's prudent advice based upon the objectives, risk tolerance, financial circumstances, needs of the retirement investor, and without kind of regard to the needs of the advisor or the financial institution. And investment advisors are kind of familiar with that standard. Second is you have to charge no more than reasonable compensation. And I get asked a lot of questions on whether reasonable compensation means you have to be the cheapest advisor out there, and it doesn't. And the Department of Labor kind of touched on that when it did the rules. Reasonable compensation doesn't mean the lowest compensation. What it does mean is it has to be reasonable in light of the services that you provide. So if you're providing Honda level service, you shouldn't be charging Lexus level prices. And I think the DOL actually used the McDonald's example, but it's just kind of easier to think of like a kind of average household brand and a luxury brand. They're just looking for consistency between pricing and service and products offered. So we're not looking for lowest possible compensation, but reasonable compensation. And then the third is you can't make any misleading statements about investment transactions, compensation, or the conflicts of interest that you're subject to. I haven't met many clients that tell me that they mislead their clients, but that's right in there. No misleading statements about investment transactions, compensation, and conflict. Then you have to implement policies and procedures reasonably and prudently designed to prevent violations of the impartial conduct standards, those three things that I just talked about. And that, especially for brokers, can mean new policies to act in the best interest of the client, not just suitable. You have to notify the Department of Labor that you're relying on the BIC exemption. You have to refrain from giving or using incentives for advisors to act contrary to the customer's best interest. So that's paying kind of your personnel based upon transaction-based compensation. And then there's a big disclosure component. You have to disclose the fees, you have to disclose the compensation, you have to disclose material conflicts of interest associated with your recommendation. And the heart of that best interest contract exemption is the best interest contract that has to be executed with each retirement investor. So, essentially this full BIC exemption allows you to do commissions, but you might not want to still do commission-based products. One of the results of this is it might push you to kind of what we call a level fee, and that's what we call a streamlined BIC. So when I said before not all BIC exemptions are created equal, there's a streamlined BIC for a level fee fiduciary. So that's a fiduciary that doesn't charge based upon transaction-based compensation, no commissions, no 12B1 fees. They charge based upon a fixed fee or assets under management. And that level fee fiduciary gets a break in the streamlined BIC. and it's especially relevant, or likely will be relevant, when recommending IRA rollovers. So what you have to do for the Streamlined BIC is you have to have the written statement of fiduciary status and a written rationale for the recommendation, but you don't have to have a contract. You don't have to have the contractual and transaction-based disclosures. You don't have to have web-based disclosures that go into that kind of disclosure component of the full BIC. There's less record keeping. There's less notification requirements, all generally applicable under the BIC. It's a big break under the Streamlined BIC, but you still have to have a written rationale for the recommendation as to why it's in the best interest of the client. So I've been advising a lot of clients, and I've seen a lot of, especially brokers, that are kind of getting pushed to fixed fee arrangements or level fee arrangements because they don't want to do even the full BIC. They want to do the Streamlined BIC. But one thing to remember is if you're advising a client to roll over or even change from an account that's commission-based to a level fee-based account, you still need, if you're subject to this rule, that written rationale for the recommendation. And we, the financial institution, don't want to be subject to the full BIC isn't a particularly compelling rationale. So if you're thinking about moving clients from commission-based to level fee-based and you have the BIC going from the full BIC to the Streamlined BIC in mind, think about doing that before this rule becomes effective. Right now, the effective date is set for April with full effectiveness in January 2018. But think about moving those accounts before you're subject to this rule if you want to move them from commission to level fee. Some things I'm often asked is, can the BIC contract waive rights? The DOL touched upon that. It cannot waive a client's rights to participate in a class action or bring a class action. It cannot disclaim liability or limit compensatory remedies. It can have an agreement to arbitrate, although the arbitration can't be in a distant forum. It can have limits on the remedies, so you can limit rescission of the contract of a remedy, and you can waive punitive damages, not compensatory damages, but you can waive punitive damages to the extent permitted by whatever law is applicable. So there are limits in what you could put in the best interest contract in the favor of the financial institution, but there are some things you can add, such as the arbitration clause and such as waiving punitive damages or rescission of the contract as a remedy. There are kind of intermediate level BIC exemptions for ERISA plans, but I want to make sure I get to all the content and give Mike enough time to talk. So I'll move on to the second exemption, which is the class exemption for principal transactions. And for that, I think this will be less utilized as the BIC exemption, but it's still important because it still covers principal transactions, transactions with a client or the retirement investor from its account with an account of the financial institution. And it also covers riskless principal transactions, so it's still important. These are more basic requirements, and you'll notice if you look at the slide in the bullet points, there's overlap with the requirements of the BIC exemption. So you still have to acknowledge your fiduciary status. You still have to adhere to those impartial conduct standards, and this rule keeps coming back to those standards over and over. That's advice in the investor's best interest, no more than reasonable compensation, no misleading statements about investments, compensation, or conflicts of interest. So you still have to adhere to that. You still have to maintain your assuring best execution. You're not misleading. You still need those policies and procedures designed to prevent violations of the impartial conduct standards. You still have to refrain from giving incentives for an advisor to not act or act contrary to a retirement investor's best interest, and you still have additional disclosures. So one thing you kind of see over and over is the importance that policies and disclosure and documentation becomes in the best interest contract exemption, in the principal transaction exemption, and in that impartial conduct standards. So, essentially, who does this affect? And I get asked that a lot. One, it affects investment advisors. And yeah, investment advisors were always fiduciaries, but this kind of raises the bar, especially for retirement money. And you might have a client that has retirement assets with you and also has non-retirement assets with you. So it kind of makes record keeping and tracking more difficult because the same client or the same investor could have two different types of assets with you and be subject to two different standards, which you need to track or just go to the lowest common denominator. So investment advisors, still need to review your contracts, still need to review your fees and revenue, and still need to review your procedures. For brokers, new fiduciary duty standard, it's a bigger deal for you. You need to review your revenue streams. You need to review the exemptions, like the BIC exemption, to see if you could rely on it. You might even be pushed to level fees so you can have the streamlined BIC, and I've heard a lot and seen a lot of clients moving in that direction. One, because of the business policies of kind of the movement away from the conflicts of interest that commissions bring towards the level fees, towards the fixed fees. Even without this rule, I've seen that movement. And then you have private equity and hedge funds. It's debatable, but I think the better opinion right now is that soliciting an interest in your fund is not a recommendation under the DOL rule. But if your fund consists of plan assets, that 25% threshold, if you're a fund manager, you're probably familiar with that. This rule kind of raises the bar, and you have to once again look at your fund agreements, look at the revenue streams, look at the conflicts of interest, and see if you need the BIC exemption or something else. So the key takeaways, you're going to get tagged with fiduciary status if you're making recommendations to plan assets and IRAs. You have to review your revenue streams, review your advisory agreements, review your representations, review your process, because process becomes very important and documentation becomes very important, because if that evidence isn't there, it becomes a proof issue. So with that kind of note on documentation, I will virtually hand the mic over to Mike.
Thanks very much, Scott. Appreciate that presentation, and I'm going to introduce a new one for you, which is, if you're Canadian, I guess that would be a BIC A. Would be the so you can throw that one into your kit bag of BIC pronunciations. So Scott's given us a good background on the DOL Fiduciary Rule, and I'm going to take it more from the systems and process side of things, just so that we can talk about what that means for organizations that are going to be subject to the DOL rules. So first off, just an understanding, one of the questions that we get a lot is will this actually come to pass? Is this something that will ultimately get repealed under a new administration? Is this the new norm? And to put it into perspective, the global fiduciary rules that are out there that are contemporary to the U.S. DOL Fiduciary Rule, these aren't new. In 2013, the UK created theirs with the Retail Distribution Review, Australia created theirs with the Future of Financial Advice, and Canada created theirs with the Client Relationship Model, and more recently now with CRM2. So, at the end of the day, the DOL, the U.S. DOL Fiduciary Rule is really, of the group, probably the weakest of the contemporary, but it is following in line with what we are seeing on an international basis. So we can safely say that fiduciary standard is inevitable, with or without the specifics of the DOL rule today. So will they get watered down? Possibly. Will they be sustaining? In all likelihood, yes. So this is something that it's important that organizations are prepared for. Now, I bring this up because there was an SEI Advisory survey just recently that looked at the preparedness, or surveyed advisors with respect to their preparedness for the DOL rule. And 89% of advisors indicated that they're not prepared for the DOL rule. Or if you want to look at the opposite of that, 11% indicated that they were prepared. Now, as compliance officers and individuals responsible for compliance, this should be really disturbing, particularly if you've been preparing for the DOL rule for a long time. Because clearly that means that there is a disconnect between the advisor's understanding of what being prepared means and what the organization is actually ready for. So this is a critical component for us to try to close this gap, to understand why there's this gap, and to try to quickly close it, because April will be on us very soon. So it's important that we begin to understand and then ultimately close this gap. So looking at the key DOL compliance measures, and Scott has done a great job of laying out the details of some of these as the key elements. There's the requirement to act as a fiduciary, as we know, having the act in the best interest of the client and demonstrate that you've done so. Converting non-compliant accounts, so converting the non-compliant high commission accounts over to being compliant. The BIC and the PT exemptions with implementing the new forms into the workflow for best interest exemptions. The disclosures, that ensuring that there's sufficient documentation. The fair pay aspects as described by Scott. And then ultimately the employee training, which might be just where that gap is coming from, of knowing what conversations to have, which forms to give out, and what they can and can't say, and what is reasonable compensation. What does that mean? Now, the challenge when we look at any piece of compliance, and I work on the compliance side not only in wealth, but also in the payment industry and in general banking. The challenge when it comes to aspects of compliance is the rules, which are incredibly objective, are very easy to follow. I either did it or I didn't. They're very binary. The problem, of course, is when we get into the subjective ones. And as you can tell, and even as described when we need to use a Honda Lexus example or a McDonald's and otherwise example, we're obviously into subjective issues. And the problem is that fiduciary compliance won't really matter if you can't prove it. And so this is where the aspects of what can we do as an organization with respect to proof, how are we satisfying that with respect to proof, and how can we actually create the trail becomes the most important aspects of it. So I'm going to just describe a circumstance, and we're going to introduce a couple of new terms for everybody here. So the circumstance we're going to describe is really simple. An advisor fills out the BIC exemption, client doesn't date it, which we all know happens all the time. They execute, trades executed, ultimately loses money, and the information gets entered into the CRM or whatever system it might be that records all of these events with respect to paperwork and documentation the next day. So this is a classic situation of, in fact, everybody did the right thing. It's just when did the systems get updated. Now, it's important to understand in systems, as a technologist, we really look at systems in two aspects. The first aspect is what we call an as-at system, and you can think of that like a balance sheet, which is as at this point in time, this is what the value is, and that records very accurately the balance on this account is X as at this day and time, or the records indicate that this paperwork has been in place as at this day and time. And most CRM systems, most systems are recording are as at systems, which is logical because they should be. They should be showing the current state of your client, the current state of your paperwork and your compliance framework. The other types of systems, however, are what are called temporal systems. And temporal systems are actually measuring and maintaining a record of what happened when. So more of the trail of the journal entries that led to that ultimate as-at position on the balance sheet, or the as-at position in the record-keeping system or CRM system. CRM, sorry, customer relationship management for those that were trying to avoid acronym. So the problem, of course, is when an auditor comes in and they see that a trade loses money, and that's internal or external or whoever it might be, and they see that the information in the as-at system is actually a day later than the trade, well, now they have to dig for evidence. Now, a good lawyer like Scott will have no problem at all pulling together the circumstantial evidence of dates and times on the calendars when people met, and all of the various aspects that would indicate and would clearly show that the meeting happened, that the paperwork was filled out, and that all of this was done in compliance with the rules for the DOL Fiduciary Rule and other rules within your organizations. But the challenge is that now was something that somebody had to do. because as at isn't representing the full picture, temporal would be. So, really the issue here is making sure that we don't give a thread to pull on, because as soon as we start looking into the timing of this is off, now we have to get into all of those other subjective questions. We're opening up ourselves to the questions of subjectivity of what are the various other elements that were supposed to be covered off. Was the employee properly trained? Were the appropriate disclosures met? Was the advice given consistent with that of a fiduciary? What are the fees that are associated? And this just opens up because we have a simple area that we've left ourselves exposed from a systems and process perspective. So, Jeff Schwantz from Morningstar has a great quote on this where he says, it's all about the burden of proof. If the plaintiff's lawyer says, why do you think this advice was in the best interest, a broker-dealer needs to be able to respond by walking through the entire process, detailing the interlocking control mechanics that were used to determine, demonstrate, and document best interest. And it's this aspect of the burden of proof that we want to try to make sure that is systemic in the organization as opposed to being a burden on the organization. So much of what I'm going to discuss today is, well, how do we do that? What are the things that we need to do in order to make sure that we are creating a framework for compliance that is simple and that is easy and that is part of what we do so that the advisors can be very easily trained on it and that they can have that confidence. They can move beyond that only 11% of them having confidence to all of them having confidence that they understand how these things work and that they know that their actions are actually leading to the outcomes that will keep them within compliance. So we'll talk a little bit about, from a systems perspective, what are we really trying to do? So when we teach people about systems with respect to compliance, and whether that's regulatory compliance, as we've been discussing here in this webinar, or whether that's even the risk compliance that we deal with when we're dealing with organizations like Visa that we work with, what we're really looking to do is to make sure that the process, that it needs to be easy, and it needs to be seamless, and it needs to be automatic. Now, it seems like very simple words to be using for this, but it's unbelievable the number of times that what we try to do as organizations is that we say, well, there's a new rule coming in place, and therefore we need a new policy. And the reality is we can't just rely on policy. We need to make sure that we have adapted our systems so that they are keeping track of everything that needs to happen and everything that has happened in a way that leaves a nice tight box for compliance so that we can ensure that when it is looked at, there are no threads to pull on. So let's start with easy. We talk a lot over at Agreement Express about what are called desire paths, and the idea of a desire path is just the easiest path for people to take, because that's what folks are going to do. If you think of what is the single most convenient thing that a person can do in order to complete their job, and chances are that is the natural path that they're going to take. So your policy that you put in place in order to maintain DOL fiduciary compliance needs to be a byproduct of the easiest option that there is for the advisors to complete their job. If you layer in something for them to do that is an add-on, that is a burden, they will take the natural human tendency to try to avoid doing it, and they will try to get their work done. If, on the other hand, you can structure your work in such a way and your systems in such a way that there's one place for people to work, that just the act of doing their job is within the compliance policy that you've set, then what you're doing is you're creating an easy path. We have to remember that when we talk about why do people follow particular systems, why do they take a particular path, what is that desired path that they're going to take, is that they're going to move for whatever is the most convenient. It is the reason why on a cold, wet, rainy day, we'll go to the convenience store that's at the base of our building rather than walk 4 blocks to a grocery store, even though it would be less money and higher quality product after the walk. The reality is we're going to go to the easiest. So easy is key to making sure that you can have confidence in your organization's ability to maintain compliance. Second is that it's got to be seamless. The audit trail fidelity can't be compromised by you having to cross systems. So the way to think of that is the more places I have to go to stitch together the audit trail, the more risk that information will not be accurate or up-to-date between systems. The fidelity is lost. Some of the information that was captured in the first section was not carried forward to the next system. This makes the job of not only the compliance officer that is trying to make sure that all the rules are being followed when they're doing their own internal audit before external, but also for the auditor, where they have to now understand timing differences and information differences and what's been updated, when that was updated, who updated it. And it's this loss of fidelity across the systems that becomes an incredible challenge when you're trying to build a bulletproof and seamless audit framework and compliance framework. So the key here is making sure that the audit trail fidelity cannot be compromised. In other words, I can go to one place and in all likelihood, whatever the system is that is temporal, that records exactly what happened, when it was done, and ultimately those records might go into an as-at system, such as a CRM system or a document repository or whatever your organization might be using. But ultimately, if you have one place to audit, and that is the, as our clients call it, the repository of truth, if that's the repository of truth, then I'm in a strong position to be able to say, I know exactly what happened with this client, and I know everything that they were presented, what was executed, what was communicated, and how all of that got into then the final record-keeping system. Now I'm not dependent on auditing the as-at system. I'm only dependent on looking at the temporal system, because ultimately the as-at system, like your CRM system, is just going to reflect what was the result of all of the actions recorded in your temporal systems. Finally, what you want is you want to make sure that that these systems, that the activities you're putting in with respect to a policy are automatic. The best policy is the one that your team doesn't have to think about. We cannot underscore enough in all of the markets and all the industries that we work with, from compliance departments to risk and underwriting departments around the globe, the big thing that we focus on is making sure that it is automatic. That just the act of people doing their jobs ensures that everything that they need to do in the context of the type of interaction they're having with the client is complete, and they don't need to have to remember to do something. When the systems are automatically putting the correct exemption forms, for example, into the package of documents that are going to the client at the right time, then you know that you can have confidence that nobody missed anything. When I have to go around and train people or teach people, remember in the following circumstance you need to do X or you need to do Y, then this is an incredibly challenging circumstance. How am I going to get there? How am I going to make sure that people remember? Am I going to rely on training? Am I going to rely on my trail of education with my advisors and my brokers to make sure that they understand what happened? Or am I going to rely on the fact that the system just makes sure that it happens? And clearly, automation is the key to making sure that you can have confidence as the ultimately responsible individual, that you can have confidence that everything was followed and that you will not be offside of the rules, save the advisor that may give bad advice. As Tom Cora from Fidelity said, the best firms are going to utilize the coming of this rule to both comply and to potentially adapt their businesses to compete in what may be a much different environment moving forward. They're going to find a combination of processes and technology that will ensure that compliance doesn't add a tremendous amount of cost to the way that they do business today. Now, I couldn't agree more with Tom on this statement, except I want you to think of it in another way. Many times when organizations approach compliance rules, they look at it, as Tom has said here, that it doesn't add a tremendous amount of cost. The reality is, if you appropriately organize your systems, these systems can actually drive cost down. Compliance can actually become an element of strategy for your organization in ways that you can be more efficient, more cost-effective, and ultimately drive a better client experience, which is really the goal of organizations. So if we approach the introduction of systems for meeting the DOL Fiduciary Rule as being a burden, if we approach it as being just another cost of doing business, we're really leaving ourselves short. The reality is you should be able to put in systems that allow this to become more of the strategic fabric of your organization to drive down cost, to improve efficiency, and ultimately to improve the client and advisor experience, which should be all of our goal because that's what's going to make our organizations more competitive. So changing the way that we look at this, because this is not just folly, this is completely possible, that this is how your organization should be approaching it, is key. Systems are always going to outperform policies. It's one of the most important aspects to remember is that we can write policy all day long, but it's the system that actually manages and engages and interacts that policy is key to us actually having something that we can rely on, and something that from the broker and the advisor perspective, that they don't need to think about. It is automatic, it is seamless, and it is easy. And those are some of the most key aspects with respect to making sure that our policies are being followed. The policy should follow the system, not the other way around. Otherwise, we're going to be relying on humans and training, and even more costly enforcement and audit, which is not the place where you want to be confirming that people are actually conforming to your policies with respect to DOL. So what can you do? The first thing that your organization could do is it's implement the key DOL measures, the BIC exemptions, and the documentation for every situation. This is taking a look at how do we interact with our clients today? How do our advisors and brokers interact with their clients so that we can determine where are the gaps with respect to the DOL measures that we need to fill. It's important at this point as well to be taking an audit of the existing systems to see, well, how do they actually record their information? Are they recording the information on an as-at basis, like a balance sheet? Or are they recording the information on a temporal basis, like a journal entry or chart of accounts? How are we actually recording this information? And keeping in mind that systems which are as-at systems, trying to make them temporal is a near impossible task. So Don't try to do that. Just make sure that you're supplementing. You realize that the question is, are those systems, the ASAT systems, are the ultimate destination? Well, then let's find a way, let's find a road that gets you to them that can meet all of those exemption documentation and everything else that we need along the way. That is in a temporal base that we can then deposit the information. You then want to conduct an internal audit of all the areas that rely on manual processes for documenting compliance, because anything that's manual is a massive weakness for your organization. And looking to see if that's the best place to go, it's the old rule of follow the paper. The best thing to do is to begin to look through the organization and say, where do we manually print things off and re-enter it into another system? Where do we accept paper and that we have to then record it in some way, shape, or form? How can I eliminate all of those manual components? Because those manual components will be the source of timing issues, loss of fidelity, risk to the organization. Those are the ones that ultimately we need to make sure that we are not leaving ourselves exposed. And I can almost guarantee that's also your best opportunity for you to turn compliance from being a burden into being an opportunity for your organization by saying, okay, if we can automate this section, not only can we ensure that we're going to be complying with DOL Fiduciary and other rules that the organization has set forth, but we also will be able to say that we can eliminate some cost, that we can redistribute some of our labor into other areas of the organization, or liberate them to other opportunities at other organizations, so that we can we can maintain our competitiveness as an organization in a world of ever-increasing regulation. Finally, you want to make sure that you're complementing your CRM or your system of record with a client onboarding system or platform that's going to make the documentation automatic, easy, and seamless. Like I said before, these systems that exist today that are recording what is the exact profile of the customer, what is my client profile, are their records up to date, is everything sound for this client, those systems are fantastic at recording as at. They are not fantastic at recording how do we get there. The example that we like to use for people is, you can think of it as the issuance of a passport. When a person has a legitimate passport, then a system of record will show that I, Mike Gardner, have a passport issued by this government on this date, and it expires in 5 years or whatever the time period might be. On the other hand, when something happens, when my passport is called into question, when the auditors look at my passport, what they want to see is what process was followed for the issuance of that passport. And if you think of all of the systems that you have in place as being the management of making sure that I not only have a perfect, pristine record of what is it that I have today, but also how did I get there, now you can have confidence in your compliance structure and in your systems as you move forward. So these are the things to keep in mind. Clearly, I'm got a strong bias towards onboarding platforms to do that. There are many ways to do there, but the key is being able to realize that you can get to these things quite quickly. Appropriate systems that sit on top of your CRM system can be put in place in a very short period of time if they're well constructed. And by very short, I mean literally in weeks. I mean, you could start and you could make it in time for April if you haven't done anything yet. So you could start now and you could get there. And it's important that people understand that to get this stuff is not a massive gutting of systems. It's a complementing of existing systems. If you go to gut systems, you're not going to make April. If you go to complement existing systems, you've got your biggest challenge is going to be committing your organization to having systems instead of just policies. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Svetlana for our Q&A portion. I'll give you control.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Scott, earlier for a very informative presentation. I will now begin our Q&A portion, and we do have some questions lined up. And I will first start with a question to Scott. We have here, if we only charge a management fee for all of our proprietary funds, do we still need to streamline exemption? And the person says that they are a IA registered with the SEC.
So, so the answer is kind of, sort of, maybe. So there's actually a conflicts of interest exemptions frequently asked question that the DOL put out, and there's some frequently asked questions on point with that. As a starting point, if you only provide investment advice for a level fee, then you should not need the BIC because you don't have the prohibited transactions. You are not doing a transaction-based compensation. But the kind of, sort of, maybe comes in with if you're advising somebody to roll over an account, like from a commission account to the level fee account, then that is the advice is affecting your compensation. So then you would need the BIC exemption. And that frequently asked question of the DOL has some really good FAQs on point, and they actually go through that of when a level fee investment advisor might need the BIC exemption as opposed to simply it's just a level fee, so there's no conflict of interest.
Thank you. And follow up to that, when does the fiduciary start? For example, does it start when an advisor tells a prospect to sell their current portfolio to transfer it to our firm, or does the fiduciary duty start when we make recommendations on our own funds when the money is at the firm?
So it's more the latter. So the fiduciary rule kicks in when you make it a recommendation, but there's a compensation element to the fiduciary rule. So by way of example, if you're using the BIC exemption, the BIC contract does not have to be executed at the first meeting. It can be executed with retroactive effect after a decision has been made to open an account along with other account opening documents. So the recommendation for compensation is what makes you a fiduciary, and if you're doing the BIC, the DOL has already acknowledged expressly that the first meeting when you pitch them isn't when you need a BIC contract, it's when with the account opening documents, essentially when they hire you.
Great, thank you. And I have a question here for Mike. Our firm struggles with the balance between compliance and providing good client service. Could you talk a bit about how this could be done better?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question because, like I alluded to, you shouldn't be looking at compliance as being something which is going to be a burden for both the advisor and for the client. In fact, you should be looking at it completely the other way. The key is that clients are looking for, in every survey ever done on them, they're looking for the most efficient relationship that they can have with their advisor. Clearly, the advice that they're going to get is an important aspect of it, but so is the convenience of how they work with them. So having systems in place that both ensure that you have compliance, but also that you can streamline the experience for the client so that they're minimizing the amount of paperwork that they need to fill out, that it's an efficient process of delivery so that they can be doing that anywhere they are in the world, or being able to reach back out and get assistance when they need assistance in completing the paperwork is really a big key to making sure that you're providing good client service. We spend too much time thinking about the really advanced bells and whistles of things that we can provide them to give them real-time notifications of interesting things that are going on with their account and other cool widgets that they can use, and we don't spend enough time on the base fundamentals of account opening and just processing the required paperwork of making sure that that's smooth. So the key is making sure you're using systems to ensure that that gets both a great customer service experience and ultimately making the compliance framework sound.
Thank you, Mike. And this is something more about the platform. What exactly is a client onboarding platform?
So a client onboarding platform can be broadly defined as a system that is actually a system of engagement. It is any point where the client needs to engage back with the firm for processing anything from documentation to applications to ensuring that you're capturing disclosures such as the BIC exemption forms. That all of that engagement is being done in one seamless platform. That generally it sits in front of other systems such as CRM systems or advisor management systems. So it's not in fact involved in trade, but more in the administration of the account, so that you have appropriate record keeping and documentation flowing back and forth.
Great, and I have a couple more questions, and I will just like to address, since Mike, you're the last one speaking, I will just turn it back again to you. Are digital signature and digital application forms fully compliant under the DOL rule?
Yeah, one of the beautiful things about the United States is that the U.S. has got very solid legal framework around digital execution and digital forms. There are sort of two ways you can think of it nowadays. In the old school world of digital signature, the signature looks like a big funky block with a bunch of numbers on it. That is in fact compliant under the rule. It's just can be unnerving to certain clients, in particular older clients, because it doesn't look like a signature, or it might look like a font that they chose instead of what is actually their signature. All legal, just it's a question of client comfort. The more modern and more advanced systems capture the person's actual signature, which is a digitized signature, and combine that with both the view of that signature and what's called an X509 certificate, which is the actual digital signature embedded in the background. Long story short, both of them are legally compliant. One is just more comfortable for the client than the other.
Great, and just quickly to Scott, where can I go for interpretive guidance on the fiduciary rule?
So the DOL has issued some summaries. The rule itself can be burdensome, so I know a lot of clients ask for summaries. I have a client alert that summarizes the rule. There's also the DOL summary and the conflict of interest exemptions, frequently asked questions, which I had mentioned before in response to the first question I was asked. That is a great resource. That's a very detailed FAQ. It goes on for about 25 pages or 24 pages or so, and it's an easier read than the rule itself, and it really fleshes out a lot of the details that even aren't on the face of the rule. So that conflict of interest exemption FAQ, it was put out by the DOL. If you can't find it through Google or Siri, or if you ask Alexa, you can feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to send you a copy of it.
Thank you. Thank you to you both.
I feel like we're now going to say, "Hey Alexa, am I compliant?" I could see that's my next thing, Scott. I think it's going to be great.
So true, especially with today's technology. Well, once again, thank you to both for a very informative session. This webcast has been recorded and will be available in the next hour or so, and CP credit is available to subscribers for archived webcasts through our on-demand CP library. Once again, to obtain your CP credit after the presentation, wait until I finish this wrap-up, and the webcast will close automatically. And the final examination will be presented in a separate window. Please be sure to disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. And if you have trouble viewing the CP test or receiving the CP certificate, please send an email to info@complianceweek.com. This concludes our webcast. I would like to extend a special thank you to our speakers, Mike Gardner, CEO at Agreement Express, and Scott Moss, co-chair of Regulatory and Compliance at Lowenstein Sandler. Apologies. My name is Svetlana Gabin from Compliance Week, and it was a pleasure being with you today. Have a great day.